Hi everybody, very nice to see you all. I know we're covering a topic of enormous interest to many people, so I am very grateful that you've all decided to spend some time with the TTF talking about a remarkably important question, issue, topic, the case for radical reform of the financial sector, specifically the banking sector. And this is a topic I know that we've all got an opinion on, and hopefully everybody's going to get a chance to share their thoughts during part of the program tonight. We've got a great turnout. We're expecting a fair number of people, and we've already got a great turnout already. So I'm going to cover the basics. I'll first of all, of course, introduce myself. I am Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a collaborative campaigning community that is dedicated to helping ensure that the financial services industry looks after and cares for and treats fairly consumers right around the world. We are increasingly international. We have approximately 3,000 members now, and of those, about 1,000 are spread across Europe, North America, i.e. the US and Canada, but also Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong. We have a few members in India and a few members in South Africa. And the balance, approximately 2,000, are people who are within the UK. And we're expecting that community to grow. There is no evidence whatsoever that we are peaking. On the contrary, we know that if we had more resource, we could grow the TTF very quickly. There is a massive interest around the world in this idea of the financial sector becoming more serving of society. And at the heart of the financial services sector, we have the banking sector. They are pretty much inseparable. Things that happen in the banking sector have a massive influence on the way the financial services sector as a whole works. So I know we're going to be in for some pretty interesting thoughts and ideas being shared by our speakers. I'm especially grateful to all of our speakers. We've got Kevin Hollinrake MP. For those of you that don't know, Kevin and his colleagues do a wonderful job running and leading the all-party parliamentary group for fair business banking, which has done a super job in recent years in campaigning for the interest of consumers, particularly people who have had run-ins, let's put it that way, with the banks in relation to business banking matters. We've also got Stuart Woolard. Stuart's a long-established member of the TTF. Stuart runs the Maturity Institute, and he has all sorts of models that will help us understand the dynamics and culture and pushes and pulls within the banking sector. And he's going to be bringing to the surface a lot of really credible information that will help us to understand what's making this sector tick and what differentiates between those organizations that are quite progressive and reform orientated versus those that are, shall we say, the laggards, the ones that are really holding up the pace of change. We're also going to be hearing from Tarek Devani, who's got lots of thoughts about these topics, and somebody I know many of you know, Professor Nigel Harper, who will compare and contrast how things used to be in the banking sector to how they are now. In a moment, I'm going to be talking about violation tracker for reasons that will become very clear. Before I do that, I'm going to invite my colleague Alexandra, the TTF head of events, who does an amazing job running our events program. I think we've already run, under your leadership, Alexandra, 24 events maybe so far this year, something like that. And I think we've had probably about 1,000 people through our Zoom meetings so far this year. It's been a particularly busy 2021. So Alexandra, could I please invite you to take care of some housekeeping notes before I jump into talk about violation tracker and then pass over to Kevin Hollinrake. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and hello everyone. So just first of all, to let you know that we are recording this event. We will try and have it edited and uploaded hopefully tomorrow or maybe the next day, so it'll be available to watch on our YouTube channel. But I'll email you to let you know when it's uploaded. Also, just to encourage you to use the chat the Zoom chat to introduce yourself, put your contact details, any comments you want to make about speakers, about the talk tonight. I'll circulate the notes from the chat in a follow-up email tomorrow. And finally, if you use Twitter, please do tweet about what you're hearing or what you're seeing at tonight's event. I'll share our Twitter handle and some hashtags that you can use.
Thank you very much indeed. That's absolutely perfect, Alexander. Super stuff. Okay, let's dive straight into Violation Tracker. But just before I do that, let's use the chat constructively to share thoughts, ideas, contact details if you wish. Let's use it to kind of engage with each other whilst the speakers are speaking, so on and so forth. I think you'll find that a very useful thing to do. But I will now spend a few moments talking about Violation Tracker for reasons that will become very, very clear. Violation Tracker is something I stumbled across last year. I stumbled across it when doing some research for our book. I'll talk a bit more about our book later on. And this is it. So Violation Tracker is a US database. He says as he's just lost his connection to it, bear with me. Violation Tracker. And what it does is exactly as the name describes. It tracks violations. There's nothing else in the world like it. There are things that do a similar kind of job, but nothing really quite like this. And there are some particular features within Violation Tracker that make it quite unique, particularly what they call the parent subsidiary matching function, which means that if an organization breaks the rules, not only does Violation Tracker record it against that organization, it also records the infringement against the parent organization. And this is very, very important. Otherwise, it would be possible for infringements to be kind of hidden in small, insignificant subsidiaries. Violation Tracker understands that and has a way to actually deal with that matter through the parent subsidiary matching function. And what you can do with it, you can do loads with it. It actually has within it 483,000, that's a huge number, isn't it, folks? 483,000 civil and criminal cases from more than 300 US agencies. Remember, this is a US product, a US tool with penalties of $667 billion, not million, $billion. So it really is a massive, massive database. It's incredible that they managed to do this. I'll just quickly show you the different agencies that are connected to this database. When I say connected, that makes it sound like it's a tech exercise, but it's not. There's a huge amount of manual intervention where the data from these different agencies is literally typed into a database. A lot of work is done by many people to make this product work. And what's really interesting about this product for us this evening is what I'm about to show you. So the first thing you can do is you can click on largest penalties. And what struck me when I first ever did this, I thought, crikey, first of all, I thought BP, hold on, this is a US database, but British Petroleum, BP, still manages to be the largest infringer of US rules, even though it's not a US organization. So BP in 2015 were prosecuted by the DOJ, that's the Department of Justice, for environmental infringements, a fine of $20.8 billion. That's massive. But then you have Bank of America, obviously that's financial services, VW is motor vehicles, then JP Morgan, financial services, UBS, financial services. And if you look down the third column in from the left, you'll see that financial services comes up rather a lot. It really does come up rather a lot. And that's because, I'm very sad to say, financial services, which of course includes the banking sector, is the worst violator of all industries, according to this database in the US. And I can see no reason at all to expect a different pattern in other parts of the world. In fact, what you can do, another very clever thing you can do with this database, is you can actually click on industry totals, and it will give you a ranking of all the different industries. And here you have it, ladies and gentlemen, financial services, $331 billion worth of fines against it. Second is pharmaceuticals, third oil and gas, etc., etc. In fact, financial services is such a grotesquely bad infringer of the rules and regulations that I think you have to add up places 2 through to about 8 or 9 before you have the equivalent of financial services. In other words, financial services is worse than the sum total of the pharmaceuticals industry, oil and gas, motor vehicles, etc., 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 etc. It really does show that there's something particularly wrong with the financial services sector. And when I stumbled across this last year, it helped me realize that, frankly, what I've been saying for years, i.e. there's something wrong with financial services that needs sorting out, really is true. And this is hard evidence backing that up. And when you click on financial services, it takes you into the next level of detail down. So it gives you the top 10 worst offending organizations: Bank of America, JP Morgan, Citigroup, all household names, all spending a fortune on, really nice advertising, etc., etc. It's rather worrying that a British bank is in the top 10 there, even though this is a database against US agencies. So we've got Royal Bank of Scotland in at 8th place. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah, 8th place. But then look at this. What you're looking at now, folks, is the largest offence at the top all the way down. So these are individual cases. And when I first saw this roughly a year ago, I thought, there's something wrong here. The same banks are being caught doing the same things time and time again. They're doing something wrong. They're being caught by the regulators. They're being fined, but then they carry on doing it. They call this recidivism. Recidivism is where an individual or an organization carries on doing what got it or that person into trouble in the first place. And what this points to is really significant, because it points to the idea that there is something culturally wrong within these banks. They are predominantly banks. There is something within the banking model that means they make so much money when they are doing wrong things that it kind of pays them to carry on doing it. And there's also something wrong with the enforcement and penal mechanism, because ultimately the bank ends up paying a great big fine, which of course is paid for by the shareholders, perhaps people like you and I, in terms of our pension funds, our ISAs, our investments, etc. But the actual leadership team that did whatever they did that got the bank into trouble is very rarely dealt with on an individual basis. And what's really remarkable about that in the UK context is that as Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, said, the single biggest change in regulatory enforcement since the global financial crisis was the idea of bringing about individual accountability. In the UK, we call that the senior managers certification regime. But for reasons I still can't really get to grips with, my understanding is that the senior manager certification regime has never actually properly been used once. So there seems to be a bit of a disconnect here between the way the banking industry works, the regulatory response to the infringements, and everything just kind of going on as normal. So that's why I believe, ladies and gentlemen, it is perfectly reasonable to propose an idea that the banking sector needs a radical reform program. If we just carry on tinkering around the edges and we don't get to the deep cultural issues within the banking sector, it's very likely to carry on misbehaving in one form or another. That's why this session is so important. That's why the issues we're talking about today don't just relate to the UK sector or the US sector. Believe you me, in Australia, for example, the banks are having a really torrid time because they've been found to be, grotesquely poorly serving society in Australia. So it looks like it's not a national thing at all. It looks like it's an international thing, which suggests to me there may be something at the very heart of banking that's gone awry. It's as if it's kind of lost its way in perhaps the last 10, 15, 20 years or so. We really do have some great speakers tonight who'll be able to share their thoughts on these issues in whatever way they choose to. And I'm extremely pleased to welcome our first speaker to pick up the mic, so to speak, by taking himself off mute. I'd invite, please, Kevin Honinrake, who I'm a huge fan of. I've interacted with Kevin, not extensively, but every now and then over the last few years. And every interaction I've personally had with him has been absolutely first class. And I'm very grateful that we have parliamentarians like Kevin who are working hard within the constraints and whatever restrictions there may be, but within those constraints, doing as much as he can and his colleagues on the all-party parliamentary group for fair business banking to do what they can to protect consumers' interests and help them get compensation, etc. Kevin, as always, extremely pleased to have you with us. Please do share 10 or so minutes of your time about what you'd like to say around this theme of the case for radical reform of the banking sector. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, and thanks for all the work you do as well. And Mutual Appreciation Society, perhaps, but I really do appreciate people should be very grateful for the work you do. It's hugely important to raise these issues, and we're both massive proponents of change. And I think that violation tracker is one of the tools we're going to need in the future to be able to highlight some of the issues that we've got in the sector and how we address them. But I think your point is absolutely bang on, though, because you can keep fining and fining and fining banks, and they'll just see it as a cost of doing business. So we need some other tools at our disposal to be able to really bring about significant reform. And I just cast my mind back just then, actually thinking of this whole question and my first interaction with a bank manager. And it was a guy called Ron Taylor, who ran the Barclays Bank in my town. He was my dad's bank manager. He was a wonderful chap. He was part of the Lions. He was there all his life, lived in Easingwold. Very trusted member of the community, member of the Lions, founder member of the Lions with my father, businessman in Easingwold. And when I first set up my first business at the tender age of probably 21, 22, that's who I went to open my bank account. And he gave me an account and he gave me a small loan, as I remember. And he gave me some very sage words of advice about making sure I kept a record of everything when I was running my business. But can you really imagine that happening now? You know, the connection has been lost between the bank manager and the community. And I think this is at the heart of the problem, because what Ron Taylor stood for, as well as Barclays as being the representative locally in our local town, he basically was the reputation of that bank in that community. And that's what I think has lost. If you look at the market shares of the two biggest banks in the UK, or two of the three biggest banks in the UK, the market, Lloyds and RBS, huge market share between them, and yet their reputations have been tarnished beyond belief, and yet they still have massive market shares. So we've lost the connection that you normally see in business between trying to uphold your reputation, that being an important driver of future business, and the business that comes in through the door. Those two, there's a big disconnect. So therefore, the people who run these banks, who we think on a pretty short-term basis, just do not care about the reputation. It's something, doesn't matter if you get fined. Doesn't matter if people think RBS this or Lloyds that. And they're involved in some of the most egregious banking scandals over the last 10, 15 years, of course, and it hasn't affected the market share at all. And that wonderful book called Shredded by Ian Fraser, I don't know if Ian's on the call tonight, but read that book. It talks about the history of banking, right from hundreds of years ago through to the current day, and how these very proud banks, even 2 or 3 decades ago, really traded on the reputation. All that has gone. And we had a succession of scandals, of course. PPI, which I think 40 billion quid in PPI. I think Lloyds themselves about 20 to 30 billion of that. Swap scandal, IRHP. The great financial crisis, of course, that's the reason that big fine in the US, of course, Andy, you pointed to with RBS, was the fine in the US for their securitization and you know their stuff they did in the US as well as in the rest of the world. LIBOR scandals, money laundering, foreign exchange, forex scandals. I mean, the things I get most involved with are SME banking scandals, because that's my background. So 30 years prior to entering Parliament, I ran a business, built it up from no offices up to 200 and odd offices. A business was listed on AIM, and so I'm naturally a massive proponent and somebody who argues strongly for SMEs, and so very much got involved with RBS and Lloyd's in terms of the horrendous treatment of SMEs pre and post the last financial crisis, where tens of thousands of businesses were torn apart, of course. And the thing that the golden thread that runs through all these scandals, I think, is quite simply money, and easy money. Seen as easy money for the people at the top. So gone is that thought where you have Ron Taylor who's thinking, well, I want a stable community of good businesses who bank with my bank locally, and I know going to be here in 10 years' time, I'm going to see it through recessions. All that's gone with the centralization of banking. All the local managers all went, everything's now centralized. So what you have now, the banks are run by a handful of people in the boardrooms of the big banks who simply think, well, they look at their huge market share and think, right, okay, if we start selling this add-on product, we can suddenly make a huge amount of money across our business pretty much instantly, which a proper business person doesn't think about instantly. They think about the long term. They don't think about that because their incentive plans, call them long term, but they're a short term, 4 or 5 years, they stand to make tens of millions of pounds if they can have a few good years, of course, and that's their focus. And those few good years, of course, can span a financial crisis. So what we saw in the last financial crisis, all those businesses that banked with some of these big banks, instead of seeing those good businesses through that crisis, it was better for them just to restore their balance sheet by tearing some of those businesses apart, taking their assets away from them and making money off the back of their assets by putting them in sister companies and selling them off at a profit later on. So that easy money, that incentive is left with these people at the top, have no connection with the local communities, and they know their reputation doesn't affect their market share. It's a recipe for disaster, of course, and that's why we see so many disasters. On a slightly more positive note, I have banked myself with various banks in my 30-year business career, and for the vast majority of that time, the banks have done a good job, fairly priced my account, good relationship with the managers. So it's not as if everything in banking is wrong. So that's why I don't believe we should simply, pick all the cards up that is British banking, throw it all in the air and start again. I don't think that's the right thing to do, Andy. But I do think we want significant reform. And a reason really why I don't think that will make any difference is what you're battling against here is human nature. It's just human nature. The people at the top of the banks are no different than you and I. We can moralize and say we wouldn't do that, the rest of it, but we are not sat in their seats. And there's a massive pressure in the banks. If you're a board of directors and you see another board of directors, another bank suddenly making other money off PPI, and their shareholders are getting better value, and your share price is dropping, and that's what you're measured on and incentivized by to go off and do the same thing. So as Charlie Munger says, Warren Buffett's right-hand man, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. So these incentives drive the behavior. And that, of course, means the culture. And that's what we've got to change. I entirely agree with you, Andy. We've got to change the culture. And I think there's some simple ways to do that. But as Ronald Reagan said, there are easy solutions. There are simple solutions, but there are no easy solutions. So, but what we do is quite simple. And let's not kid ourselves either. This kind of behavior is not restricted to banks. Just look at the post office scandal we've seen this week, the most horrendous, egregious scandal of putting people in prison, even though because it was financially good for your business. It's as simple as that, the most horrendous thing. So this is human nature we're trying to deal with here. And that's, of course, why we have regulators. Now, of course, I've been a massive critic of the FCA, and still am, and probably always will be, but the FCA have got a tough job, there's no question about it. They've got plenty of people to do that job. There's about 9,000 people work in the FCA and the FOS, Financial Ombudsman combined, of course. But so the FCA said, of course, we need some more, to stop this happening, we need to be able to hold people, individuals, to account. And I absolutely agree with that. That's the principle behind this. Forget fining banks. That's a waste of time. Start putting bankers in jail. Start banning bankers from the industry. Then you'll see meaningful change. One of the most iconic images, I think, of last year, the year before, was the chief executive of Volkswagen being led out of his office building in handcuffs over the emissions scandal. Those are the kind of things that would make a difference. If you think you are personally, individually culpable, then you will start to change your behavior. If you look at the numbers of deaths on building sites and on motorways being constructed and all that kind of stuff, it dropped significantly the day they introduced director individual liability for health and safety offences. That's what made a massive change. So that's the kind of individual accountability we need. So we do need the senior managers regime to be effective. And I agree with you, Andy. I've never seen it being used either. I asked this question, I think, quite recently of somebody in the FCA, and they said, "Oh yes, a couple of occasions now. We've got a couple of occasions. These haven't led to actually a sanction yet, as far as I'm aware. So we need the FCA to start using the SMCR. When Andrew Bailey was there, I asked him time and time again whether he was going to use the SMCR to sanction people at Lloyd's for their disgraceful mistreatment of whistleblower. Absolutely bang to rights. In fact, they apologised and compensated Sally Masterton for the mistreatment of 5 years, and still nobody at Lloyd's has been sanctioned, and that's all within the SMCR. So the FCA has got to be stop being supine and be willing to take forward action against senior people in organisations. But the reality is, of course, that the FCA will only ever be a watchdog. It'll never be a bloodhound. The FCA can go in and tick all the boxes once in go in and check files in different offices, but it very rarely will pick up these kind of scandals. And if you look at all the scandals we've seen that I've mentioned earlier on, every single one of them has come as a result of a whistleblower. I know we've got people like Paul Carley on the call tonight do excellent work in highlighting this stuff, and but actually getting the regulator to do something about it when they have been notified of this stuff is the devil's own work, really, which is not how it should be. So we also need to make it give whistleblowers an easier route through to highlight these difficulties. And whistleblowers should not just be employees of companies either. They should be anybody who can identify some wrongdoing. So I think one of the key changes, and you see those fines you listed on Violation Tracker there, Andy, you see those fines, there's massive, even allowing for the different sizes of the industry is much bigger in the US. There's a massive, much greater number of fines in the US and level of fines in the US compared to the UK. And one of the reasons is because they've got a great comparatively great whistleblowing regime, which does properly protect whistleblowers and compensates them, properly compensates them. That would make a huge difference. So we're trying to push the Secretary of State, Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng, to bring in some proper whistleblowing legislation that's not just related to employment contract. It is a much wider agreement than that, and it protects the whistleblowers and it can compensate them. So it does mean that more of this stuff will come out, which then gives the FCA and other regulators something to go on, and the crime agencies, of course, as some of this stuff is fraud. We need to make it easier to prove fraud. It's very difficult. You see another collapse of another fraud trial only today, of course. So as a Serco this time, but we've seen similar at Barclays and Tesco. Very difficult to prove fraud in the UK because you have to have a controlling mind to be able to, you have to prove that somebody at the top was responsible for a fraud. What the government's committed to, we keep banging on about it and asking to do this, is bring in an offence of failure to prevent fraud, economic crime within your corporate entity, which has individual criminal responsibilities attached to it. So you can be put in jail if you don't put the checks and balances in place. So that will help too. We also need to properly resource our crime agencies. I see Anthony Stansfield's on today. He will nod his head at that. Properly resource our crime agencies and properly get the structure of the crime agencies right, be that the SFO or our relevant police forces around the country, or whether it's be a regional or national approach to that. We also need to change our insolvency regime. We need a proper regulator, not this kind of mishmash of self-regulation we've got going at the moment. I think we need the Treasury itself needs to take a different approach when it actually intervenes in the market. Some of the things we've seen in some of the banks had an element of influence from things like the Asset Protection Agency, for example. So we need change there. And I do think, you mentioned Australia, Andy, a full public inquiry would be something that we should bring forward. That, I mean, the public inquiry, the Royal Commission in Australia led to the resignations and sackings of the 7 or 8 chief executives or chairs of the big banks. But as I said before, that would be good. Also potentially putting people in jail where the wrongdoing can be properly proven. There are some steps there's lots of things there that are happening. Some things need to move much more quickly. Some things aren't happening at all. So we're working all those things in Parliament, myself and my colleagues. So there is positive movement forward. The other thing that's happening is in terms of SMEs, we've got much greater free alternative dispute resolution now. So we had the FOS, which many will say were not fit for purpose, but it's better than nothing. That has a much wider remit now. And with the Business Bank Resolution Service that sits on top of that, businesses with a turnover up to £10 million now get access to free alternative dispute resolution, which will mean at a point where lots of businesses are going to get into debt, and therefore forbearance is going to happen. Stuff is going to happen in terms of restructuring. That's going to be very useful. But the fact that dispute resolution is there should stop some of the gratuitous mistreatment of businesses we've seen over the last few years. And finally, the thing we need to do, of course, more than anything, is we've got a hugely concentrated banking sector, which I referred to before. We moved from the Ron Taylors of this world to this very centralized banking sector. 80% of SME lending is with the big 4 banks, for example. We need a much greater diversity of banks, not just all commercial banks either. So non-bank lenders, people like Tide and the like, we need to see more of those coming along and flourishing. Regional mutual banks, massive. We used to have lots of them in the UK. They all kind of disappeared and got swallowed up by the big banks. But there are 1,500 of these in Germany. There's loads more thousands in the US and Japan. Just to give you a really interesting stat, in the from 2008 to 2013, the amount of finance in circulation to SMEs dropped by 20% in the UK. It grew by 25% in Germany. And that's because regional mutual banks were giving finance to businesses when they needed it. So regional mutual banks who are not incentivized just to provide returns to shareholders, actually they're not for profit, and they make sure they have this good relationship, that Ron Taylor relationship with their customers. Same with CDFIs, community development finance institutions, same with fintech, and potentially digital currencies. So Bitcoin will come along in the form of a central bank. Bitcoin that can create more competition too. But with all those things like regional mutual banks and CDFIs, what they do is they stop just lending into areas that inflate assets, house prices, commercial property. They start to lend into the productive economy, businesses that manufacture, that produce, that serve, that employ, that create wealth, they create jobs, they make places, they support local communities. That's what we want to see. So banking, like Ron Taylor, should have a social purpose in our communities and not just be there for the purpose of returning monies to shareholders.
Kevin, wow, that was absolutely superb. I can't quite believe how much you crammed into a relatively short period of time, but also so clearly and in such a clear and balanced way. I think you've delivered a very fair and balanced account of where things are. And there really is a lot happening. There really is a lot happening. Nobody can deny that. I'm going to, if I may, Kevin, just pick up on a few minor things, and then we'll share open to questions and comments from others. I know Stuart's going to be talking about some of the issues you've just touched on in terms of the kind of the purpose dimension. So I'll leave that area completely to Stuart. The mutual bit is a real worry right now. I watched, how sad am I? I watched the Treasury Select Committee session last week with Jonathan Glenn, and one of the most worrying things that came out of it was Angela Eagle MP's comments about what I'm just putting into the chat. She explained, and I'm not quoting her directly, but the general gist of it was, she explained that one of the mutuals, LV, yeah, it looks like it's going to get bought by a very predatory venture capital organization that apparently has a stated intention of buying up other mutuals. So we have this dilemma at the moment. We've got mutuals like, Avon, etc., etc. Maybe Kip Beasley will comment on this as well. We've got some people working so hard to get brand new mutuals up and running, creating, viable business models. And we've got the real risk of venture capitalists, probably from outside the UK, coming in, gobbling them up, making them sort of, ultra commercial, no doubt stripping out more profit in the short term, making a lot of money, and then, exiting stage left in 2 or 3 years' time, leaving what could have been a very long-term business at risk. There seems to be a pattern that's coming up time and time again. There was a program on the TV a little while ago about the way venture capitalists have done a lot of damage in the high street as well for these kind of short-term issues. Is this something that Parliament could look at in some way? I think it's bound to be of interest to some MPs, not just Angela Eagle and folks like her. Any comments on that, Kevin?
Yes, a lot. There's an all-party group for mutuals, and we did which I sit on, and we did an inquiry into sale of LV to Bain Capital, and a pretty scathing report. We produced a report on the back of it, and what's happened there is quite incredible. You got a guy called Mark Hartigan came in as chief exec, came in with a non-mutual background, so he was with a mainstream commercial insurance providers prior to that. Came in, this business was no plans to demutualize. In fact, he absolutely said it wasn't going to. It changed its actually status. It was still a mutual, but it changed its status slightly. And now, obviously, with a view to a demutualization, which made it easier in the status it went to, and kind of circumvented its normal accountability to its members. Really unhappy about it. I think it's, from my view, it's very much appears to be an opportunity for the chief execs to make a few quid quickly, and that's, I'm sure there'll be good plum jobs coming in a commercial sector with, as you say, with private equity, which will invest in it and probably flog it off a few years' time. Yeah. The board will probably earn a lot of money out of it, and I think that's probably the driver. There didn't seem to be any other commercial driver for that. It's well capitalized. The mutual sector is really important. It's of course, if you remember these things, we've all done it. We've all carpet bagged, and the building society era of the 80s and 90s, how they all demutualized, and we all made a few quid out of that. But it's very short term when you look at where the state of play today. So, I mean, I was going to say, private venture capital, private equity does a good job in many ways. It frees up. It boosts returns. It actually gets businesses that are in the doldrums working again. It has a role to play, but I think that I'm as concerned about that demutualization as you are, Andy.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We're going to go to Anthony Stansfeld and then Gavin Palmer in a moment. I'm just going to share my screen once again for another important bit of news, which is that you won't all know this. Violation Tracker, which I was speaking about earlier, is coming to the UK. So hopefully by mid-November, the first UK iteration of Violation Tracker will be up and running. There's been a shed load of work gone on behind the scenes to make this happen. We've had support in Parliament from people like Kevin. I'm so pleased to say, people like Lord Seeker. And that's interesting, because you really are talking about people with completely different political views, I would imagine, but all embracing the idea of transparency and shining a light on when companies don't behave the way that they should. So that's good news, folks, and we've got quite a bit of momentum now being built around this. So we're going to go to Anthony first, then to Gavin, then to Kit. If I can ask all the participants today to be as short and succinct as you can with your questions and comments, just so that we get as much chance as possible for many people to be involved. So Anthony, great to have you with us. Please do start off with a brief intro, Anthony, because not everybody will know who you are or what you do, and you're hyper relevant to this particular event. Thank you, Anthony.
Yes, I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner for the Thames Valley, which was the police force, the only police force that's prosecuted a major fraud for years and years, which was the HBOS fraud at Reading, which was a fraud getting on for £1 billion. So we only prosecuted on £245 million. And again, I don't think a lot of the people who should have gone to jail did go to jail, but we won the case. It cost us £7 million to bring that case. Lloyds were fined £60 million by the FCA eventually, but they found nobody personally responsible within Lloyds. It was reduced to £45 million for Lloyds cooperating, and all that money went to the Treasury. Not a penny came back to Thames Valley Police. So the incentive for a police force, and we're a big police force, to take on a major fraud simply isn't there. And all of these cases, which Kevin brought out so well, they are not civil matters. These are fraud. These are criminal, and they are not prosecuted as criminal matters. And some of our police forces, I have to say, I'm coming to the end of my time as PCC in a week's time. Police forces simply, even when it's quite clear fraud is being committed, will not investigate it. And if you complain, put in a complaint, what happens? It is looked at internally by the police force that refuses to do anything. If you take it externally to the IOPC, they have no investigatory capability on fraud, they just refer it back to the police force. If you complain to the minister, which I have done, we are told this is not something we can intervene in. And of course, actually, the Home Secretary has ultimate responsibility when something is clearly going wrong in a police force. And I can show that in at least 3 police forces. And what should happen, of course, is an outside regional serious organised crime unit should be put in to investigate it properly for fraud and have the money to do so. And what is so extraordinary in some of these things, you actually find the bank is financially sponsoring the very police forces that should be examining them, which I find almost unbelievable. I think, was it £1.5 million a year goes into the City of London from Lloyds, I think it is. I can't remember the figures, but it is quite extraordinary. And it does demand, I'm afraid, at the most senior level, at Home Secretary level, an intervention to look into certain police forces and the way they are covering up what is criminal fraud, and the sums of money are vastly bigger, I can assure you, than the money involved in the drug industry. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Anthony, for being with us and sharing your points so impactfully as you always do. We'll go round to Paul, Gavin, and Anne-Marie, then we'll return to Kevin, and Kit Beasley, then we'll return to Kevin for some final comments from Kevin. So Gavin, please be as succinct as you can. You're one of those guys that can almost out-talk me, Gavin, and that's saying something.
Okay, so Kevin, I've been involved actively against RBS since 2007, which is before the actual financial crisis, and I was one of the people that spotted a link between all the insolvency practitioners. What I notice is that shareholders have been ever greater marginalised and ever greater penalised by all these fines. And as you say, rightly, we should actually go directly for the people. The difficulty is actually changing the management. Now, all these big banks should have at least half of the board be actual bankers. But if you look at something like RBS, or whatever it's called, NatWest Group now, there is very, very few people who have actually come from a banking background. John Major would have more banking qualifications than any of them. So the solution, which is an elegant solution according to George Osborne, is to have a shareholder nominations to the AGM committee, which has been working in Sweden for 25 years and is probably the reason for their excellent governance and management. And what that does is it keeps large shareholders elected for a year, so they sort out the problems. And they can, although they don't have much any other than the convening power, collectively 4 large shareholders will have more than 5% of the company's shares and can put forward a resolution, an EGM resolution, in a very short period of time to remove a director, and therefore they can exercise their powers without actually having to boot the door down in the very difficult election type climate. I also think we've done a red herring by introducing compulsory voting, because it has raised the number of voters from 40% to like 95%, which makes it very difficult for the institutions to get 200, 300, 400 institutional committees to all agree in time and get their votes in to defeat any sort of resolution. So they know they're immune. So SNAC shareholder committees, they're proven successful. It would need to be done in a instant. It doesn't take long, and it only costs £20,000 a company. And quite frankly, even if the government sponsored the rooms for 3,000 companies in the UK, it would be an excellent return on investment.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll come back to Kevin at the end, and he can provide a kind of a wash-up set of comments in relation to everything that's being said. Let's now go to Kit, then we're going to go to Anne-Marie, then to Paul. Kit, very good to have you with us. Please do introduce yourself and your organisation, because I think of us as being kind of cousins in a way. We're very much putting on the same ropes. I'm very pleased you're here with us. Kit, please do introduce yourself and make your point. Thank you.
Lovely. Okay, thanks very much, Andy. Yeah, so I'm two things really. I'm the chair of the Finance Innovation Lab, which works hard on trying to make the financial system work better for people and the planet. But of probably more immediate relevance here, I'm also a non-executive director on Avon Mutual, which is one of about 18, one of a number of banks that are trying to set up as mutual banks under new legislation that was passed in 2014. To allow, because previously banks were not allowed to be mutuals in the UK. And as somebody said before, I mean, the mutual sector, the mutual banking sector in other countries is much, much more prevalent. It's a dominant part of places like Canada, Germany, lots of other places in most OECD countries, and yet it's not in ours. We've ended up with a situation where we've got building societies that are very restricted in what they can do, credit unions very restricted in what they can do, and big banks. And the result of that really is that those banks kind of suck the money out of local economies and just invest it wherever they want to invest it, wherever they feel that they can make the most for their shareholders. So what we're trying to do is kind of bring local banking back in a format where effectively local savings are supporting local businesses and the local economy. So SMEs in particular tend to drive the economy, and there's a bit of a gap between that transition where an SME moves from being a sole trader to being an SME. There's very little banking support for that transition, and I think, having worked with Regulators for a long time, and I've visited places like Brazil, you can see that is the crucial thing that gets people out of poverty in some places. It allows them to work their way out of poverty because they can start a very, very small business and they can move up and turn it into an SME. There is really no support for that in the UK in terms of what the financial system does. So that's one of the things that we want to try and tackle. And effectively, it's kind of bringing, as I say, bringing money back to supporting the local economy. But we face some quite big hurdles. I mean, when we first talked to the regulators, they didn't actually even understand the regulations and the legislation under which we were being formed. It's not known, and they have trouble getting their heads around the idea that a bank might have social motivation and not just financial motivation. And then things like competition law, it's really hard to do this without kind of bumping into things like cartel legislation and so on. So we're trying to get around those barriers. We hope to do so. We have absolutely no intention of demutualizing. That is just not on the cards at all. And we hope to be up and running in the next couple of years. One of maybe about 18 local banks dotted around the country, all trying to do the same thing, getting lots of support from people like Kevin, like John Glenn, and so on, which is really fantastic. But there are some quite big hurdles we still have to overcome. So any support, very, very welcome.
Kit, thank you very much indeed. We know Tony Greenham quite well in relation to Southwest Mutual. We got to know Tony through the RSA. The former chief exec of the RSA spoke at one or two of our events, and we got to really understand what they're doing. And it's a great initiative. It really is. And wouldn't it be a pity if at one end we have these new mutuals springing into life, if at the other end they're being gobbled up by private equity? We need to manage time pretty well, folks. So I'm going to go to Anne-Marie, then to Paul Carlier. Anne-Marie, your point, please. Thank you.
Yes, very quickly. I'm the founder of a project called the Theantara Project, which focuses in changing the education system. I have a background in business law and maritime law, but my issue with banking is it goes back to my family involvement. My father was the head of the Banque Européenne de Paris, and he was trying desperately at the end of his life to reform the whole system. It was a very hard job, and I grew up with that. So that's my investing in this is very goes back to that. My question is, what you were saying is reminds me very much of the economics, Schumacher, economics as if people mattered. And it's almost as if you were talking about banking as if people mattered. So what drives this, what can drive this change? Where do we start? Is it and what is the place of education in this change that we're actually looking for in so many ways in the financial sector?
Thank you very much indeed, Anne-Marie. You've, as always, you brought a fresh perspective to the conversation. Really appreciate that, Anne-Marie. Thank you. And now to Paul Carlier. Paul, who's been a massive contributor to TTF on many fronts, on many levels. In particular, the last few meetings we've had about the RBS scandal, the interest rate hedging product scandal. I'm always amazed at the depth of knowledge and insight that Paul brings. Paul, I need you to be quite short and sweet, which is going to be the challenge, I know, but do your best. What would you like to say? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd like to just sort of follow on from a point that Anthony made and others have been making about police forces. You know, the story over the weekend, I don't know if you all saw it, that the FCA were provided with 45 separate reports of fraud regarding the Blackmore bond, and the FCA ignored all of them. Not just ignored them, they failed to provide any evidence that they had in respect to the fraud and the dishonesty to the police. And I've now got, and I want to make that 46 now, because another victim of Blackmore has got an identical response today from the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau saying that we have been unable to identify any line of inquiry which a law enforcement organisation in the United Kingdom could pursue. That's 46. Now, what people don't know is that the Telegraph were threatened and intimidated last week by the FCA and the press office, particularly Chris Hamilton, the head of the press office, and I'm going to name names. I'm done with the FCA press office. They threatened, and the Telegraph were forced to withdraw the fact that there was an actual fraud report made in 2016 regarding the Blackmore bond, regarding those involved in the Blackmore bond, which was almost a year before my first report in 2017, and when hardly anything had been invested in Blackmore. The FCA ignored it. The FCA went on to authorise the promotions for it. Now, for the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau to come back and say, we've not been able to identify any lines of inquiry, also ignores the fact that in 2019, the SFO announced a criminal investigation into LCNF. Well, one of the lines of inquiry there is the company that was marketing it, Surge, and particularly Paul Carlis, who ran that. The FCA and the SFO know that they were marketing Blackmore as well. How is that not a line of inquiry? The reports that I made clearly said that pensioners were being told that these bonds are guaranteed by one of the world's largest banks. That's fraud. That was fraud in 2017. No bank in the world is ever going to offer that kind of guarantee. So that was fraud back in 2017. Didn't need the benefit of hindsight. The FCA failed to pass that on. Now, when Blackmore collapsed, if Andrew Bailey or the executives argue that, oh, well, you needed hindsight to determine whether that was false, well, when Blackmore collapsed, it's now been disclosed that everyone's lost every penny. So where's that guarantee? Where is that guarantee by one of the world's largest banks? It clearly didn't exist. So why is the FCA not passing this evidence on to the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau? Well, the problem the FCA has is that they dropped the ball big time on this. They can't use the same incompetence escape route that they've done with LCNF, that 600 reports, they never made it out of the contact centre. Absolute nonsense. The FCA were aware. The FCA did nothing. And rather than admit they were wrong, they need to keep the same narrative that they've managed to persuade the Treasury Select Committee that this was all incompetent. Oh, we dropped the ball. Oh, sorry, it was the contact centre. you know, if we'd known about it earlier, we would have done something. Nonsense. They knew about Blackmore, they did nothing, and now they're trying to conceal the evidence. And I've actually made the formal complaint to Nikhil Rathi and Charles Randall, and I've made the allegation that this evidence proves they are perverting the course of justice. They are still claiming that nothing about Blackmore was within the FCA's perimeter. That is a lie. It's a lie. There was breaches of FSMA, there were breaches of FCA COBS.
Sorry, Paul. I do have to go in about a couple of minutes' time. That's all. I would like to respond to some of these points. I'm sorry, Paul, but we've talked many occasions about this with the FCA, and I will come to your point in a second. They were just around the kind of different points. Anthony, as you know, I totally agree with everything you said in terms of properly resourcing our fraud agencies. You know, it was, as well as not be able to find anybody in Lloyd's responsible for the disgraceful treatment of SMEs, defrauding of SMEs at a senior level. Couldn't find anybody at RBS for what they did either. It's absolutely acceptable. So, and it feeds back into what Paul was saying. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not the FCA as such. It's not. We had an FSA, we became an FCA. We thought that solved it, and it still hasn't solved it. There's a great quote from Emerson, which is, "An institution is the length and shadow of a single man, of course, or woman, but it's got to be about people from the top." And yeah, and I mean, Andrew Bailey, of course, was there at the time, whether it be Blackmore or LCF, as you know, Paul. And so I think we need a cultural change at the FCA as well. This stuff is picked up, properly run with. In various things I've taken to the FCA, I've had to push them to investigate. Yeah. Signature fraud. We prevented some, on behalf of Julian Watts, some signature fraud. And the FCA said, well, have you got a handwriting expert to verify this stuff? So, well, why should we? Why don't you go and do that? Isn't that what the FCA should be begging for this information? So a complete cultural shift at the FCA we need. As you know, I also think we need something called the Financial Services Tribunal, which is like an employment tribunal. So anybody can take a case at any point to court without fear of adverse costs, without fear of the bank's costs being loaded on the complainant, because then this stuff gets out into the open so much more quickly. It works like an employment tribunal. Most employers treat their employees properly because they're decent people, but also because they're afraid of getting into an employment tribunal, which is very easy to access for an employee, much easier than a court, a traditional court. So that would be a big change. Gavin, in terms of your point, yes, I mean, listen, I think your shareholder action thing sounds very sensible. Happy to hear more about that. And insolvency, we're doing an inquiry now in the all-party group. Please share any information you have on insolvency, where we're very unhappy about some of the too cozy relationship with an advisor, somebody who's been an independent business reviewer of business, but then take over as the insolvency practitioner. It's absolutely disgraceful. That should be allowed to happen. I'm not sure, I know Nigel Harper's speaking a bit, I'm not sure simply having qualified bankers is the answer. I'm not saying it's the wrong thing or the right thing. I think we've seen lots of solicitors facilitate some of this bad behavior from banks. There's no doubt about it. That's supported by legally qualified solicitors. I'm not sure, just simply saying if you're qualified, you'll be okay. I think it's a bit more, there's more human element of this, human nature element of this. Kit, absolute music to my ears. Everything you said, you're absolutely right. I had a conference call with Tony Greenham and Jules last week at Ever Mutual. Massive believer of that. Getting capital is the biggest issue into your organization. Getting them capitalized. There's something on mutual deferred shares, which I talked to Tony and Jules about last week, which is an act in 2015, which allowed a much easier route to raise money from investors to fund this stuff. I've got to say, I think we're in a good space here, because number 10, I had a call with them recently. They're special advisors in there, and we're very attracted to the idea of these regional mutual banks, not for profit. I think it's a great solution to many things, not least rebuilding that Ron Taylor relationship between banks and businesses, which we lost and we want to see back. Anne-Marie, I love the idea of the education. Absolutely. Part of this is people matter. To me, I've been in business for 30 years. I built a business up from nothing, a single branch, to a national business. People always mattered, both in terms of who worked for us and our customers, because our reputation mattered to us because we owned the business. You don't need to be not-for-profit to feel that people matter. I think you just need to connect real people with real businesses and have a localized approach. And a lot of the things we've talked about do all that stuff. Return the social purpose to banks. That can be in a not-for-profit way or in a commercial way. I think either it can work, but it's hugely important that it does rediscover that social purpose.
Fantastic, Kevin. You've made a massive, massive contribution to this session. You really have. I'm very grateful to you, as have everybody that have chipped in with comments and questions. Kevin, just before you go, one further quick point from me, I should say. One of the things Kevin's done is he's been instrumental in helping to get another all-party parliamentary group off the ground. It's the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. Kevin's a member of this as well. Its chair is Peter Gibson MP, who's up in Darlington, if I remember rightly. Yeah, Darlington. And this all-party parliamentary group, and the TTF is the secretariat for it. We're very, very proud of that. We're very proud of the role we're helping in helping to run this. And Peter Gibson was quoted in the Telegraph in relation to the latest scandal emerging from the Blackmore bond story, the point that Paul Carlier made so powerfully about the FCA were told 45 times by the police and they still didn't pay attention. Anyway, Peter Gibson is basically leading an initiative through this all-party parliamentary group for what we're calling the call for evidence about the FCA. So what we're doing is inviting members of the public, people who've actually interacted with the FCA, to have a chance to share their testimony about what it's been like. Now, don't get me wrong, this could be people who've got a wonderfully positive opinion about the FCA. Their input would be equally welcome as those who might be constructively critical and more. But what we're basically trying to do is create grassroots evidence that the APPG can look at and then decide whether something more substantial ought to be done by Parliament in relation to this general question that's being kicked around from time to time about whether the FCA is fit for purpose. That's one succinct way of putting it. So that's a really important development. Kevin, let's all take an opportunity to show our appreciation to Kevin for turbocharging the start of this session. You really have. Thank you very much indeed.
Very kind. Thank you very much. Nice to see you. Thank you. Thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And we're going to go straight from Kevin Hollinrake to Stuart Woolard. Stuart is very, very genuinely somebody I admire. He's a thinker. He analyzes stuff. He looks at things from the point of view of data and knowledge and understanding. And he really is able to share what the data is actually telling us in such a wonderfully meaningful way. Stuart, I'm going to ask you to unshare for a moment. I'll tell you why. It's all right. I need to move over to speaker view first. That way we'll all have a larger picture of you when you're sharing your slides. Please do pick up from here and do your stuff. You do it superbly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thanks for everybody's contribution so far. It's fascinating to learn more and more about what's going on in the world and how we can try and fix it. What I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to present some evidence. We primarily look at the health of organizations through a financial lens. So auditors sign off accounts. The business press reports on earnings, and the market primarily looks at the growth of profitable companies, and that's the primary driver of share prices and how we regard organizations in terms of their success. We look at the health of organizations through a human lens, and we create ratings which mirror the Standard & Poor's type credit rating scale, and our organizational maturity index ratings were specifically designed to create an alternative and complementary indicator to a typical credit rating. And that's the background why you've got that visual on this particular slide, so that we can start to understand that the health of organizations isn't just what the financial records tell us. We need to look at what's driving financial outcomes and increasingly other outcomes, and we'll talk more about those outcomes, good, bad and indifferent, as we go through this. But I'm going to present some evidence on the banks. But just before I do that, a little bit more detail on our methodology. So what we call OM index, or organizational maturity index, rates materiality, the value created and risks reduced in the way a company manages its human intangible factors and across all its stakeholders, so workers, customers, suppliers, regulators. And when I talk about human intangible factors, we're thinking about issues of leadership, management quality, culture, governance, the management of human capital, be it within your workforce or in a supplier context or wherever it may otherwise touch your organization. So these things which really drive value and risk and are ultimately the causal drivers of why corporations fail or that they succeed. The OM index uses 32 diagnostic questions, and they're grouped into 10 core indicators. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see those. So purpose, human governance, innovation, improvement, human capital, risk, culture, stakeholder authenticity are some of those sort of question clusters. The other thing we do with OM index ratings is it forms the basis for what we calculate as what we call total stakeholder value. Now we talk about shareholder value all the time, and Kevin talked about incentives. And the problems of many organizations, including those within the banks, is that we're incentivized to drive financial return, short-term financial return and shareholder value. And that's typically at the expense of other stakeholders. Our ratings tell us how an organization is creating value across all its stakeholders. And when we integrate a financial performance metric, and for listed firms, we've used price to book ratio as a measure of shareholder value, we've created a new metric called total stakeholder value, which we believe is a much better representation of the totality of value that any organization creates. For the purpose of this presentation, we'll look at the OM index ratings, and you can kind of use the ratings and TSV, or what we call total stakeholder values, one and the same. So that's a little bit about the methodology. Let me just, these are the 32 questions, and before I move on, I'm not going to go through all these, it will take us a long time. Each of these questions is causally connected to value and risk. We do not ask the question unless there is a causal connection. We have a set of diagnostic rules which interprets, which underpins how we interpret and judge scores against each of these questions, and we use multiple sources of evidence. One of the sources of evidence we use is the violation tracker, which Andy has been talking about a little bit earlier. And that's an invaluable tool because it's independent and it's objective, and it gives us very hard data. It is not something which the company is telling us to look at. And that's really important. We want to use lots and lots of sources of data, but violation tracker has been great. And it helps us to consider things like question 7 on here is on values. So if you are telling the world that you're a learning organization, but violation tracker is telling us that you have a history of firing whistleblowers, that doesn't seem to support the fact that you're saying what your values are as a contra indicator. Similarly, if you're telling the world that people are your greatest asset and that you're all about workforce cooperation and collaboration, and you've got a history of firing people and unfair dismissal in private tribunals, again, that's evidence which helps us to get under the skin of an organization and put together robust, objective judgments and scores against all of these factors, which in aggregate give us our rating. Now, slide 3 takes us to a banking sector set of ratings, and we started rating the banking sector properly in 2017. We'd actually done some ratings in 2015 when we first created OM Index, but we did a big study in 2017, which was sponsored by Hermes Investment Management, and we were interested to understand to what extent the worst banking offenders in misconduct terms had improved from a human intangible health perspective since the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Since then, we've done a number of other ratings. In fact, we've got more banks in the cohort, and some of the ratings we've been updating since 2017. But this is the latest set of ratings. And you'll see on the top right hand of the slide is Handelsbanken. And I think, as Kevin was talking about Ron Taylor, I think Handelsbanken probably represent an organisation full of Ron Taylors. And unfortunately, within this cohort of banks, it is the only one that really stands out head and shoulders above the rest. The important thing about this slide is that it's telling us that there's a relationship between organizations that create more value through all their human stakeholders and financial performance. And we've got operating margin plotted against this. So Handelsbanken is our highest rated bank, and it stands out in operating margin terms. And this is data, this actual data, the banking sector data set has been tested by the University of Cambridge Judge Business School. So we're quite confident that the causal connections, the questions we're asking, have a relationship with creating longer term financial value. And of course, the other thing about this slide is there's a midpoint where it says value and risk threshold, and any bank to the left of that is, if these were credit ratings, they would be called junk ratings or below investment grade, and we use the same language. So all those banks to the left of that value and risk threshold are essentially junk ratings in human value and risk terms. So, you know, their cultures are not healthy enough. The way they handle human governance, the way they manage human beings across all their stakeholders is suboptimal. They're not serving society. And ultimately, they're also not serving their long-term shareholders. And that's a really important message, is that we believe, and the evidence that we've compiled, not just the banking sector, tells us that good organizations and good banks should serve everybody, including shareholders. There isn't a trade-off. There shouldn't be a trade-off. I'm just going to share some statistics. I'm sorry to bombard you with a very, very busy slide. This is part of the other data analysis which the University of Cambridge did. Belle, who's a PhD student, unbelievably talented woman, who works under the supervision of Christoph Lock, who's the head of the business school at the University of Cambridge, put together this data set. So many thanks to her. But I just thought it was interesting just to pull out some of the sort of correlations. The usual caveats apply: causal versus correlation, sample size, etc. But what this is saying is that there's a strong association between higher rated banks, and towards the bottom of the slide, the higher you're rated as a bank, the less likely it is suggested is that you're less likely is you're violating national legislation, less likely it is that you're violating international standards, the less likely it is that you've got controversial products and services. If we go on, and this is a huge data set that she put together, again, the bottom of the slide, if you're lower rated, you're more likely to see fraud. So there's a strong association between lower rated banks and incidences of fraud. You'll see the line a few points up: corruption, bribery, extortion, money laundering. Again, the same applies. What is this telling us? Well, we've suggested that there's a relationship between higher rated banks and financial performance. We're also saying that these ratings tell us and give us an indication of the health of these organizations and the risk that they're carrying, both for themselves, but actually what we talked about tonight, for their local communities, their customers, and society. They are not serving society, and ultimately, these organisations won't be serving their shareholders. If well, we haven't seen enough of that, but ultimately, our wider body of evidence tells us that it's suboptimal for both the societal and a shareholder perspective. So that's that data. I think just building this and coming on to where I sort of started, we designed this to sit alongside a credit rating. So this is a nice visual because it shows us that all the banks in this particular cohort have reasonably good credit ratings. And these are reasonably up-to-date credit ratings from 2020. So it's suggesting they're all pretty healthy, certainly from a financial perspective. But it's really telling us that they're not healthy from a culture perspective, from a human perspective, and they are carrying significant risk. Only yesterday, one of the banks in the middle of this slide, Credit Suisse, was on the front page of the Financial Times for a number of scandals and failures, and the head of risk has actually left the bank. And those risk issues that manifest have caused it very serious damage in shareholder terms. So, you know, that has very much mattered to that organisation. So here we've got a picture. We need to see the health of our organisations, the health of our banks in a much more holistic sense. This slide I just thought I'd throw in because I was on the call around RBS 10 days or so, can't remember, like time flies. And I just thought I'd throw it in because this is a book we wrote called The Mature Corporation, a Model of Responsible Capitalism. And we actually highlighted RBS in a section around authentic leadership and trust. Which banks should we trust? And I pull it out because RBS was the bank that scored lowest in the 2017 cohort and continues to score lowest within our OM index rating set. These are things that should matter and should matter to stakeholders. And I think when we come to some of the key lessons and messages, we've got to learn and act upon these things. So, you know, in short, with a few notable exceptions, the banks continue to foster unhealthy cultures. They've got a significant reliance on compliance processes and compliance teams, which are designed to suppress risk. But most fail to recognise or essentially develop the human systems that are necessary for meaningful corporate responsibility. And we all know that poor or toxic cultures, in the words of Peter Drucker, eat strategy for breakfast. If you've got a toxic culture, then it will bypass your compliance system, bypass your compliance process. And actually, some of the contributors before me today have talked about that's a systemic problem that goes beyond the banks because it goes to our regulatory system as well. Two, regulatory audit and board focus has talked a lot about culture and cultural risk, but we don't see any capability, and particularly among regulators, a great deal of willingness to measure the risk of cultures. And particularly at board level, most boards do not have the tools and capability to properly assess, measure and monitor cultural risk. That goes for banks, it does for most organisations. So what are we saying about radical reform? Well, we're actually starting to work with a lot of big companies. They're very interesting in our diagnostic, primarily because investors have become interested in it, because they want to understand the risk and value implications of human intangibles. Unfortunately, banks have remained absent thus far, but yet we try and engage with them and get them involved. We certainly want banks to put total stakeholder value or societal value at the heart of their purpose. A lot of companies, a lot of banks are saying they do, but is that really the case? A lot is rhetoric and not reality. As I've suggested, our OM index ratings were designed to sit alongside credit ratings. Our view is that every firm should be required to have one, particularly if you're on a stock exchange. We would love to see regulators say that they're interested in our ratings of organizational health and send a message to banks that this matters. And for auditors who are tasked with identifying fraud and have been hauled up across the coals many times for failing to identify it, not necessarily in banks, but in a number of firms, again, don't have the right kind of tools and capability to identify this kind of risk and report on it. So we can do this and we need to do this. And so we are starting to see it happen. But fundamentally, if we don't understand the health of our organizations as well in human terms as we do in financial terms, then we're always going to be missing a very significant piece. Thanks, Andy.
That really was superb, Stuart. That really was superb. Thank you so much. We're going to throw it open for comments and questions. So I'm just going to stop the screen sharing so we can go to gallery view. Please just wave your hand if you'd like to make a point, ask a question of Stuart before we move on to our next speaker. We do need to watch the time really tightly, folks. So please be as succinct as you can make it. So we'll go to Gavin, then we'll go to Paul. Gavin, as succinctly as possible, please. Thank you.
I've won a stock picking competition by several 100%, based on the analysis of qualitative information from Philip Fisher. and he had a criteria of 15. I don't know if you've ever seen the common stocks and uncommon profits. The final question was, does the management act with honesty, integrity, and trustworthiness? And if they didn't rate 5 out of 5 on that, he never invested. And I would suggest you have a look at that sort of index, because those sorts of questions give significant weight, because if they're willing to lie to you and you're a regulator or someone else, then they're willing to lie to their employees and everyone else. So.
That's a massive point, Gavin. Can you please pop a link into the chat to that Fisher person you mentioned? That's absolutely superb point, Gavin. Thank you. Mr. Paul Carlier, back to you.
Yeah, I think what I've witnessed in recent years is that shareholders and the big sort of institutional shareholders are investing on an entirely different premise. For example, December 2018, Lloyds are forced to admit publicly that they had lied about the HBOS Reading fraud, they'd lied about the Project Turnbull report, they'd lied about abusing Sally Masterson, the whistleblower. Nobody's paid the penalty. Nobody at Lloyds has lost their job for that systemic failure. And within 3 months, the Lloyds shareholders, more than 95% of them, voted for a substantial remuneration package for all of the board. The problem here is that you have, I think what we were saying in terms of integrity, maybe it will come home to roost in the end, but in the short term, you have boards that are, in all my years in the banks, the boards were paid on the stock price, not on the amount of profit you earned. And like, for example, Lloyds would announce 2,000 redundancies because they know that, right, we're coming up to bonus time, so we'll announce 2,000 redundancies. That saves costs. Investors love that. The stock price goes up. It will breach thresholds that we need to breach to qualify for our bonuses. But what they don't tell investors is that they replace those 2,000 full-time employees with 1,500 to 2,000 contractors who they pay 2 to 3 times as much, but who don't come up as staffing costs. They come up as they're booked elsewhere. So it's, and obviously over maybe 10 years down the road, this might come back to roost. But in the short term, investors are investing, irrespective of wrongdoing or fraud.
Thank you, Paul. That's a very real world account of the short term as we see it. Thank you, Paul. Let's go back to Stuart for some final comments before we move on to our next speaker. Stuart, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Gavin. Question 32 of our OM index talks to that exact question, which is on authenticity. So we're looking at the authenticity of leadership, essentially the gap between what the company says about itself and the reality based upon what the evidence tells us. We also measure trust specifically around question 6, and that's also focused on leadership. So I think your point is very well made. It's certainly something that is really critical from our perspective, and something which is specifically taken into account. And as I said, a violation tracker is a wonderful tool to help us, help us distill, rhetoric from reality. I think Paul's point is, talks to a much bigger issue and wider issue, which is that, the problem of the system that we're all working within, which is still based around shareholder value. At the moment, we are in the early stages of, an ESG revolution, if you like, a revolution of saying we should price responsible businesses with a premium. If they are truly responsible businesses, that should be reflected in the market price. The problem is we haven't got good metrics around it. We're still using through a financial lens. Our OM index rating is used very, very scarcely with it's a pinprick on the back of a massive, elephant of called the investment community. It's just we are just starting to get to grips with issues of governance and issues of societal or humanity and pricing in what a truly responsible business is. And until we do that, what you've said, Paul, is exactly right. We are still giving far too much credit to organizations who chase short-term profits, cut people at short notice. What we try and show is even for those organisations that do cut costs in that way, actually they're doing themselves in, because they're actually destroying their own value, even, you know, in destroying the very people that they're doing in, so to speak. But yeah, these are systemic issues. You know, your point on executive pay is built on the back of shareholder value and profit maximization, and it still is. It is just starting to shift. But the more we can push investors to really understand the organization through a human lens, not just the workforce, but customers, local communities, and really understand that really does matter. I mean, the funny thing is, when you talk to an investment fund manager and you talk about Handelsbanken, they all nod their head and they say, really, really well run organization, fantastic, really, really solid bank. But then on the other hand, they're not helping us to promote more Handelsbankens. And coming back to Kit, you know, we need to promote organizations that do truly want to serve society and local communities, and do that across, you know, the entire system. What we're about is providing the evidence to show that those kind of organizations do succeed and do create value for everybody. The more we can do that, I think that again, we can just put more evidence out there.
Thank you so much. This has been a great session, a really great session. A quick point from Gavin, and then we'll show our appreciation to Stuart for a superb explanation of the work that he and his colleagues do. Gavin, to you, please. Nice and short and sweet for me. Thank you.
The city, because they've got such a change in their funds, how they manage their funds, from having big lumpy holdings to being an index tracker, they tend to exit and run out rather than sort out the problem. Because if you had 5, 10, 15% of a company, if you exit, the price crashes. So the old guys used to sort it out, and you sort it out by sorting out the management. And that incentive has gone because of the index tracking. So that's why having a shareholder committee brings back what you call now large shareholders. You might have like 1, 2, 3%, to provide that sort of weight. Basically by threatening to put it into an AGM as a resolution.
Thank you, Gavin.
With facts, because each of the resolutions, you might have, you know, removed this person as a director and employee of the company, but we've got 1,000 words as well as an explanation, as well as probably another 800 that you could put in the resolution.
Thank you, Gavin. We're going to be moving on. Before we do that, 2 things, please. First of all, can Stuart make sure he puts a link to his contact details, website, etc., into the chat, because I'm sure there'll be lots of people who've heard what you said and would like to know more. And secondly, can we please all join our hands together to show our appreciation to Stuart for what he's presented today? Thank you very much indeed, Stuart. Well done. Very, very well done. Always a pleasure to have you with us. I think Stuart's going to be speaking again at an event we've got on the 20th of May. Alexandra, could you please pop the details about the 20th of May event into the chat? If anybody wants a free place at that, then you're welcome to come along. That's all about Violation Tracker, why it's coming to the UK and what it means to you, whether you're an investigative journalist, a member of the public, an ESG specialist, a campaigner, an activist, a politician. It's really, really good news, I think, that Violation Tracker is coming to the UK, and Stuart's going to be speaking at that event as well. We're now going to be moving very, very swiftly on to Professor Nigel Harper, who'll be speaking for up to 10 minutes. I need to manage time, please, Nigel. Up to 10 minutes. Please do share your thoughts in a compelling way that you do. You always speak from the heart, but with literally decades worth of hard-earned experience at the very, very, very centre of the banking system, and you're occupying just a small space in our view, Nigel. So please do move yourself a bit closer to the screen if you can, so we can see you better and probably hear you better as well. Okay. Professor Harper, to you. Thank you very much. Lovely. Go for it.
Thank you very much, Andy, for the introduction. Stuart, just an answer to your question about Handelsbanken, all their bank managers are qualified chartered bankers. That probably gives you a clue as to how successful they are. Right, moving on. I'm speaking to you tonight as a qualified professional banker with 50 years retail banking experience, and as a former chairman of a FTSE 100 banking group arrears committee member. I have over 25 years lending and board and senior management experience. I'm also chairman of the Ethical Banking Standards Council and ambassador for the Transparency Task Force, which I'm very proud of. If I look back over the last 25 years, we must admit that the performance of business banking in the UK has lamentably proven that banking has failed us all. It's a commentary of sadness, certainly to me. I had a very disciplined training environment when I joined banking. And that stayed with me most of my life because I imposed discipline on those that worked around me. Serious scandals and abuses that never seem to end, a series of unresolved problems resulting in numerous victims that have been denied justice. We now have a banking system that is prone to failure. Coming out of that, I feel there are 5 key issues which need addressing. Firstly, business banking not being a regulated entity and remaining a non-regulated entity. This is not appropriate. It leaves this as an open season for those that gain banking. Point 2, lack of standards and practice. Not enough and not being applied. Accountability is lacking. Point 3, lack of standards of ethics and conduct. Qualifications and training are necessary, resulting in there being no yardsticks for bankers to follow. The acceptance of fines as being acceptable for bankers to operate in the country has led to failed governance and standards in banking. Point 4, now this is quite an important point, and this relates to legal and one-sided regulated provisions, one-sided contractual provision, one-sided security provision, one-sided enforcement, insolvency, administration provision. Other issues to be considered are dealt with, like, for example, current bank lending contracts to business are exempt. The perimeter is a fallacy. Change in material circumstances by bankers, changing covenants, which causes detriment to customers. This is the major cause for banks repossessing properties and businesses, because bankers change the rules. Point 5, there's a lack of effective means of redress. The BBRS does not provide adequate redress that is required, and FOS does not help. The restrictions and limits are unworkable. My summary of the situation is this. I've talked you through the 5 key issues that need resolution, and the killer is that these have all come together at once. The pandemic has made this more critical, especially with the C bills and B bills insolvencies looming. I met with Andrew Bailey and Davidson in 2015, and I pushed the point that the bankers needed qualifications and expertise to run banks and be in banking. They fought me tooth and nail over a period of about 9 months because I would not let go. The reason that they ultimately gave me was that the Treasury would not like qualified bankers to be qualified, and the banks would not like bankers to be qualified. That was the bottom line. I think it's a scandalous situation to find a regulator admitting to me. Needless to say, I was furious. Now, what I'm recommending is quite unique here because it probably was in effect in 2071 to 80. After that, following Brown's intervention, we had a situation. Right, what I'm recommending here is 2 regulators, 2 new ones, divorced from government and run and controlled by qualified professional bankers of my generation, because we understand how banking works and we understand the disciplines required. Now, if you look at the professional complaints regulator, no, I'll go to the controller first. The controller for banking does just that. They watch over the chairman and the board's behaviours. They investigate and review everything they do, from the credit committee to policy and everything else. The controller for banking will also have a whistleblower protection department. It will also have a fraud and police investigations department ensconced within it, reporting to the controller. The chairman and board monitoring and control department will look at selection, qualifications, CPD, authorization and employment and sanctioned appointments. We will look at employment policy. We will look at lending and product risk policy. Also we'll be looking at the authorization and control of stock market listings and banking licenses. Currently, it's a fiasco. I'll tell you why, and that is anybody who's been fined still has have banking licenses and stock exchange listings. Well, the rules of the stock exchange are quite clear that people who've got a record against them cannot be listed on the stock exchange. And I mentioned this to Andrew Bailey, and he promptly tried to change the rules, probably more or less within 24 hours of me mentioning it. But I also kept the email chain of that communication, which I also sent to the London Stock Exchange, saying, look, you can't have bankers listed on the stock exchange whilst people are being fined. Again, they changed their rules, but I still have the email chains which confirm my advice to them, which was to suspend stock exchange listing and bank licenses until they sorted themselves out. Anyway, what we have now on the controller for banking is we've got to look at the regulators that we have today. There's a gamut of regulators: the Failed Financial Conduct Authority, the Financial Ombudsman Service, National Crime Agency, the FPC, Financial Reporting Council, etc., etc. We need 2 regulators, full stop. And those people will be responsible, or should be responsible, for making sure that banking operates successfully and cleanly and trustworthily. Lobbyists would not be allowed to have any influence over the controller for banking, nor would they have any control over the professional complaints regulator. They wouldn't have access. The professional complaints regulator is quite an interesting character. We are looking, or I would recommend we look at rewriting FSMA. Now, I worked in Revenue and Customs for 7 years, and my role there was retail banking specialist. And I looked at loads of frauds undertaken by major banks in this country. And I wanted to prosecute certain chairmen and prosecute them for money laundering and also breaking the large business exposure rules. I wrote a 76-page report, which I sent to Andrew Bailey, which was promptly binned for very obvious reasons, because it did affect one of the biggest banks in the world. But that indicated that these tax avoidance schemes that bankers run with, and any accountants run with, then are deleterious to UK PLC's financial health and well-being. As I say, the Financial Service Markets Act needs sorting out. The General Data Protection Regulations need sorting out because they hinder freedom of information passing swiftly between both the controller for banking and the professional complaints regulator. Now, this happens today between HMRC, the Treasury, the FCA, FOS, and everybody else. I had real battles with them when I wanted to report frauds and criminal actions that I came across. And luckily, one of the frauds that I came across, 3 Citibank directors were prosecuted and are serving time. And I'm very proud of that fact. The employment laws need changing to reflect the privileged position that bankers have in the community. Bankers and financial services personnel are in effect trustees of their customers' health, wealth and ambition and well-being. You know, we have a responsibility to our customers. You know, we have to, you know, in the old days, we used to grow up in the communities. We played rugby with them. We went to the lodge with them and all this sort of thing. You know, they knew us, we knew them. That has all gone, unfortunately, and been replaced by salespeople at the end of a phone. That has never worked. The Companies Act is quite an interesting act because it allows bankers who have been fined to to continue as directors of banks. I find this iniquitous. Also, the shadow directorship laws need tightening up, because many a time when you're looking, especially at repossessions and liquidations that I have looked at, and behind me I've got 62 cases which have gone to various members of government today as a result of some excellent work done by some other person, a friend of mine, which shows the criminality within banking, within the police, and within the regulators. Hopefully that will have some effect. The document itself is about 1,400 pages. The next thing is SMCR. This is a litigant's paradise that will result in no sanctions being taken by regulators against the transgressors. This needs rewriting to ensure that privileged stations of bankers and financial services management cannot escape their liabilities and obligations in the future. You know, if you look at the way the SMCR is set up and operated, it's never going to work. It can't work because the lawyers will delay, obfuscate, and lie for years. Next thing is HMRC tax laws. These are unwieldy and result in lengthy litigation and disputes, and agents earn handsomely from these battles. Now, the professional complaints regulator is totally responsible for all agents: lawyers, accountants, debt securitization bodies, valuers, auditors, vulture and hedge funds, insolvency firms, ratings agencies, investment and retail bankers, and bailiffs, and anybody else involved on the periphery of banking. They will police those agents rigorously. There will be a compliance and governance department who will analyse the complaints relating to all financial services and banking agents and their firms. They will identify systemic risks of people, systems, governance, and products. Investigation of complaints and systemic risks, when identified, will be reported to the Controller for Banking, who will then take affirmative action through the Fraud and Police Investigation Department with reference to the Bank of England or another body. The another body we do not know, but it could be the PRA, but it certainly won't be the Treasury, or shouldn't be the Treasury, because the Treasury is the root of all evils, in my opinion. Nothing good has come out of the Treasury since Gordon Brown deregulated banking or released banking from its shackles. So that's what the professional complaints regulator will do. The big issue is people. The big issue also is government, the Treasury. It is not the management, because the management have not been trained, they are not qualified, and therefore they do not know what they're doing and how they should act. Svenska Handelsbanken's management are exemplary in this particular position because they are all qualified, and that is why Svenska Handelsbanken is probably the best bank in the world as we speak.
Nigel, thank you very, very much indeed. We are very grateful to you for sharing your thoughts. Many, many, many years at the centre of banking have led Nigel to have a profound insight to what's going on. Nigel, one quick question for me. Can you, and if you can't, when can you share more information about the what sounded like some evidence that you submitted today? Can you tell us any more about that, or does it need to wait until another time?
I've got the 3 binders on the back chair there. I've already sent them to one set to Priti Patel. I've sent another set to the leader of Eastbourne Council, because I put a proposal to the Treasury of a committee of the council asking that they close their accounts with Lloyds Bank for criminality of extreme nature. He has said he's going to read through it. He already agrees with me that bankers who have been fined should not be supported by ratepayers and taxpayers. And he is very interested in seeing if he can make an example of Lloyds Bank in the Eastbourne and Lewis councils. Now, if that happens, and I hope it does, we will have set a precedent which hopefully will catch fire across the country.
Wow, that sounds like a very, very interesting development indeed. Can we please all show our appreciation to Professor Harper for sharing his thoughts today? Thank you very much indeed, Nigel. Great job. And we're going to go straight to Tarek, and then after that, we'll be finishing at roughly 8 o'clock, maybe 5 past. But we'll keep the channel open for those that want to hang around and have a very, very informal, networking conversation. Tarek, please do introduce yourself. Of course, take yourself off mute first of all. And if you can speak for, say, 10 minutes as agreed, that would be super, Tarek. So over to you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We can't hear you, Tarek, so there must be a technical problem of some kind at your end. What we'll do, we'll do things back to front, Tarek. It seems like there's a problem with the technology at your end. So what we'll therefore do, folks, is we'll open it up for Q&A now. And if Tarek's able to rejoin shortly and speak, then we'll be able to do that. So please do wave your hand if you'd like to share something. We'll go straight to Gavin Palmer. Gavin, please do speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Harper. Yes, and I think one of the things that is interesting is looking back through the numbers that seem to be compromised. We've now got Andrew Bailey, who's the governor of the Bank of England. There was Gordon Brown, who had RBS's H quarter next to him and allowed the massive takeover of NatWest and ABN AMRO, and breaching their normal reserve ratios, and also causing the Lloyds that was kind of claimed to take over HBOS. And then there's David Cameron with Torex Retail in Banbury, where GRG did over that local constituency business, which had 2,500 employees. And there's the number of MPs that particularly that bank have that are in a group of 8 or 10 in Parliament that sort of are guided by them. And I was just going through each of the different regulators, particularly Mr. Bailey in FCA, now the Bank of England. And this is going to need, with all the, the big four accountants as well, there's going to need to be an enormous shove on a lot of different areas at the same time to reset all these different areas and to draw a line so that these people stop bad practices and act with the honesty, integrity and trustworthiness that we would expect of the banking sector. And what I realize is we may have been having lots of minor fights here and there, but we haven't got collectively to happen overwhelmingly with HM Treasury and the others, all the different bits to come together to sort this once and for all. And that's what I noticed. I've been adding a recent one about the lobbyists and things. So that's what I think, Professor Harper. I think there's been too many individuals and not enough connection to transform this, because there's a huge amount of vested interest, particularly with the American banks dominating London, merchant banks and investment banks and advisors and accountants' advisors to go up against.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you very much. We're going to go to William May, who I think wanted to make a point earlier. So, William, if you still want to make a point, please take yourself off mute and say your piece. Thank you.
Yes, I just had a point for Stuart to mention that I've been championing the cause of the Lloyds frauds recently, and I've had occasion to contact S&P, Moody's, Fitch, and Morningstar, all about the points which you've raised in your excellent presentation. I've been drawing their attention to ESG, and needless to say, there's been absolutely close to zero response from them. Nothing from S&P, nothing from Moody's, nothing from Morningstar, but a response from Fitch, where one of the senior people at Fitch came back to me and said that the very relevant points that I'd raised about governance and the existence of serious fraud within Lloyds wasn't really of great concern to Fitch. What they were looking at were the actual financial ratings of the various instruments that they put they give ratings to, and that they really didn't think that this this matter of serious fraud dented the ratings of these particular instruments that they rated. That was their response. I thought that was pretty shocking.
Thank you very
Shall
much.
I respond to Andy? Or?
Yeah, please do. Please do. Really interesting point.
Yeah, thank you, William. That's really interesting. We I mean, we designed our rating in 2014 with a Standard & Poor's affiliate agency, believe it or not. And S&P weren't interested then. We actually had a conversation with one of the very senior people within S&P last year, in fact, about where we are, and it didn't really go anywhere. Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with all the ESG data world is that they've delivered on quantity and not quality. So all the ratings and rankings around ESG issues are about delivering to the investment community something, 2,000 or 3,000 companies, which means that they take quantitative data at scale, crunch it, and come up with something. When it comes to things like, very human issues of incidences of fraud, which are a very serious red flag in how we rate an organization. It's a huge contraindicator. It says massive amounts about how an organization is managed, what's going on, because it's a leading indicator. It's forward looking. So I mean, it's interesting. Our experience mirrors yours in terms of our engagement with those rating agencies. I think it has to change because ESG data is poor and it's very badly correlated with both financial performance and risk, and it's also backward looking. It can't look forward. It doesn't have the ability to predict particularly well. So we're trying to change that. We're trying to say that if a company has issues of fraud, and I think coming back to what Andy said about violation tracker and why that's a wonderful database, when that comes out, that should help to provide a lot harder evidence around this. I think where we want to make the connection is that even relatively small amounts of misconduct can tell you something very significant about an organization, about its leadership, about its governance. And those small signals are really, really important for shareholders. But they're also really important if you're a customer of Lloyd's, or if you want to go and work for Lloyd's. I mean, Lloyd's will tell its grads what a fantastic company it is, but young people don't have anything to look at other than corporate literature. So all stakeholders matter, and we simply don't have enough good information out there for stakeholders to make good decisions. But that's a really interesting point, William. Thank you very much for raising it.
It certainly is, and a great response as well, Stuart. Thank you. Let's check in with Tarek again to see if Tarek can now be heard.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Lovely. Great. Please, I'm relieved for you. So please do introduce yourself and off you go. If you can be as short as you can, that would be great.
Yeah. I'll try and make it less than 10 minutes. So you don't need to look at me. I've been in financial services for 30 years or so, banking, case litigation, product development, derivatives, sort of wide range of things. I think I must have a different understanding of what the word radical means, but here we go. Here's a bank a few hundred years ago in the city of London. Depositors come with £100 of gold coins. The bank takes them, keeps them on deposit, and gives £100 of receipts. And right, so here's this bank. It takes £100 of gold coins, gives out 100 receipts, and says, "Come back with these receipts anytime you like, and we'll give you your gold coins." People start to use those receipts as money. They don't go back to the bank to get their gold coins and then go off shopping. They just give the shopkeeper some receipts and say, "Look, you go to the bank, get the gold coins if you want." The shopkeeper says, "Well, actually, I can't be bothered to go to the bank. I'll pay my employees their wages with these receipts." The employees take the wages, they pay their rent with the receipts, the landlord accepts it, etc., etc. So the receipts have become money. And this is a very important development in banking, because when people start to regard the receipts as money and not receipts for money, then the bank starts its lending business. And what it does is it creates, in this example, £400 of receipts out of nothing and lends it at interest. The reason it creates the receipts is because it can make profit by charging interest on loans. But there's a legal problem, because the bank has created £500 worth of claims on the same £100 of gold coins. If I did that in house building, if I built houses and for every one house I built, I sold it 5 times with 5 separate sets of title deeds, that would be called fraud and I go to prison. But banks have the full protection of the law in doing exactly the same thing. They don't do it with paper receipts and gold now. They do it with electronic databases. They send you a bank statement telling you that you've got £500 in the bank, but they've only got £100 of reserves. Actually, they've got much less than 100 out of 500. It's more like a 5% reserve ratio now. But anyway, this is what banking is about. This is where the majority of its profit comes from. And you cannot build an economy or a society on fraud. And unless this is addressed, then nothing else you guys are doing is going to make a blind bit of difference.
Yep.
Yeah, you make your point so well. You really do make your point so well. And you reminded me of the conversation we had all those months ago. So Tarek, let me put a question to you, if I may. I understand the point you're making, and what you're saying, it comes as a bit of a shock to a lot of people, because we kind of think that the bank lends the money that is given to it by depositors, and they charge, let's say, 3% interest, but they only pay 1% interest, and they make a bit of a margin, and that's how the banking system works. But you're saying, as of course I understand, and many people say the same thing, you're saying that no. What actually happens is the banks actually make money from thin air. It doesn't actually exist at all. They make money, they make profit on the money that they've created from nowhere. And the net result is we end up with a complete world ecosystem that's stuffed with debt. You know, it's foie gras debt.
It goes everywhere. The plastic in the sea, the forced economic growth as people struggle to repay these debts. I mean, I know we're out of time, but I mean, if you just, I'll just show you the one thing that you may want to see.
Please do carry on. This is going to be very interesting to a lot of people, because you're coming at this.
Okay, well, I'll show you one mathematical problem that comes. Let's say that there are £400 of debt in the society, and let's just say, to make it easy, that have been loaned at 30% interest.
Yeah. So
after 1 year, then the society as a whole has to pay back £520. Okay.
Right.
Now, the problem is there isn't £520 of paper receipts in existence. The society cannot repay the debt that is owed to the bank. And I mean, if it robbed the bank of the reserves, it could, but that's illegal, and it always has been. So our society as a whole is incapable, because of the nature of the system, of repaying the debt that it's in this year. And the only way that it has found to solve that problem is by borrowing more money this year from the banks in order to repay last year's debts. And with a society that is so much under debt, there is a tendency for more and more sectors of society to become in debt. Students to become in debt, old people, I mean, everybody, the indebtedness of the society can only grow over time if you pay off last year's debt by borrowing more this year. And so with that race to pay off debt, corporations try to make profit. They try to do more business. They try to expand their operations. And that's why I say the plastic in the sea comes largely from this. We are forced into economic growth. I did put some other, I'll just show the other 2 slides and then I'll finish. I mean, banks create money, they lend it into house price. You know, newly created money pumps up the balloon, house prices go up. There's loans versus house prices, very clear. Some businessmen borrow lots of money, they buy up all of the competition. This is a photograph, 11 shops here, and Lakeside Shopping Centre, 9 of them are owned by the same businessman. He's leveraged, he's borrowed massively from the banks. They've created the money out of nothing. They lent it to him, their favorite customer. He bought up all the competition and created effectively a monopoly, although each part of the monopoly has a different name, as you can see here. That's just for marketing purposes. So one last picture, I mean, and this is what it does to the nature of the society. This is 200 years ago in France, where you can see the humanity, the small businesses, the small builders, the society, the local control, good quality materials. You didn't have to pay interest charges to banks. It was actually Napoleon outlawed interest charges, you know, tried to act against them. And so people could afford to build better things, you know, more than half the cost of total cost of ownership of buying a house these days is interest charges to banks. Still, even with current interest rates, 80% of the charge that we pay in a utility bill is due to interest charges. Right? That's how much of a burden. And when you don't have that, society flourishes. But when you do have this corporate monopoly, leveraged, interest-paying, money-creating world, you walk 100 yards down this street, right? This is an old suburb of Arras in France. You walk 100 yards to the right down the street and you see what modern capitalism builds as a suburb, and it's this.
Yeah.
And you only have to look at that. I mean, if you can't see what I'm saying by looking at those two pictures,
yeah,
right, then I can't say any more to you. But
yeah.
you want to, I mean, tourists will never go to see this. What we have left for the next generation is an unattractive, polluted, indebted and desperate world. And I appreciate everything you guys have said. You're clever people, cleverer than me, many of you, I'm absolutely sure of that. The data, the research, but you've got to have a think about this, because this is where it all comes from. I'm a Muslim and I've worked in Islamic banking. I've met Christians and Jews and Buddhists who have all told me that their religious laws of old prohibited interest, but they're never quite sure why. And I think this is one of the reasons, because without interest, this system doesn't work. And with equity, it does. If a bank financed people with existing money, sharing their profits, not charging interest, then it would finance the best business projects out there, the ones which were likely to make profit, because by a client making profit, the bank would make profit. But with this system, the bank lends to the person who has got the most collateral. The bank lends to the richest in the society, because the richest people have the assets to offer as collateral, and the bank's debt can be repaid. This system capitalizes, funds those who are already rich in the society.
Okay.
Equity sharing gives everybody a chance, because the poor guy can have as good an idea as the rich guy.
Tarek, very, very thought-provoking stuff, and I'm really very grateful to you for sharing these thoughts. A couple of questions, if I may, then we'll share it open, because I'm sure you've got people thinking. So let's assume somebody kind of gets what you're saying. How do you transition from where we are now to where you're describing we need to get to? It would require an almost revolutionary change in the system, wouldn't it? It would be, you're talking here about, you know, destroying one system and replacing it with another, or is there a calm, sedate way in which this transition can happen? How do you see it?
I would hope that it will happen by reason, because if it doesn't happen by reason, I believe it will happen by ecological collapse, maybe, by revolution, war, maybe. I would hope that there has to be a political leadership here, because so many vested interests will have to change their ways and give up their, I mean, look, I have to work for my money. If I had a license to create it out of nothing, why would I want that system to change? So the political leadership, this isn't a technical problem. I mean, you can see what the problem is, if you know, but the politics behind it and the vested interests and the co-option of our regulators, and all of this is part of, effectively, if you put a thief in charge of the money system, he's going to use that money system to protect him in his thiefhood.
Understood.
And so, I mean, I've traveled around the world and spoken to many finance ministers and leaders who have got it privately, and they've said, we have had a try, but we cannot do it. And I mean, as one example, the prime minister of a developing country, who I knew quite well, said to me, look, the people who really stopped me weren't in my own country. And so, you know, this is an international thing. And even if one country goes on its own and tries to reform things, then there's the international dimension. And that I really don't have an answer to.
Yeah. Two quick points from me, then we'll throw it open. This has been very interesting indeed, Tarek. Point number one, within TTF, we have 25 groups, and one of the groups is about complementary currencies. I'll state just for clarity, it's not about crypto, it's about things like the Bristol pound. So if you like, local currencies, community currencies, where people are creating an alternative local currency, which is run and governed on completely, if you like, old-fashioned lines. Any thoughts about the potential for complementary currencies to replace either some or all of the system that we currently have? That's the first question.
I think there is a role. It's a very small scale role. The complementary currency movement has been out there for decades. The Let's movement, mutual currencies, this kind of thing. They have not really made a substantial impact. Conceptually, they may have, but if you look at the total turnover, even that, you know, the great grand dam of you know, the complementary currency movement and the alternative currency movement, the WER in Switzerland, even that has a small, tiny percentage of Swiss national turnover. I think really that what we need to be talking about are solutions at the equity level. If we have a venture capital bank, let's make it a venture capital bank in that the people who put the capital in have their neck on the line. The businesses they finance, you know, pay a profit to the capital financiers if they make a profit, and if the business doesn't make a profit, then the capital financiers don't. So let's have an equity relationship to tie the two. That's permissible. It works under English law. People know how to do it. Let's encourage that more. Let's try to regulate banks in such that their money creation activity is not as parasitic. We, you know, may have some kind of state oversight of money creation, or the state may take over the money creation function and leave the banks to hold deposits and manage Visa cards and check systems and bank transfers and hold assets safe in safe deposits. All that's fine. That's what people think banking's about. Well, let's have them do that. And that kind of gradual transition, but it all, you know, it's possible and legal, and there is the framework and the institutional levers that one can pull to do that. But one has to, at the end of the day, make sure that it doesn't become just like a puppet show to sort of placate the public. You know, well, okay, we'll do a little bit of this, a little bit of, you know, reform, and when in fact the, you know, the core of the system remains the same. So. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very interesting answer. And last bit from me before we throw this open, which is, you know, from your point of view, what has been the effect of all the, you know, the massive amount of quantitative easing and all the financial activity as a consequence of the pandemic? Where's that put us? Where are we?
I think it leaves us on a knife edge. We can potentially have a very strong inflationary period. I don't know where that inflation will come. It could be general inflation, it could be further asset inflation, but huge reserves have been created. And if the banking system multiplies those reserves using the fractional reserves that were pertaining a few years ago, then all of those hundreds of billions will be multiplied, you know, 30, 40 times over in new bank lending over the coming years. If the governments try to withdraw those funds, those reserves that they've created, the M0 that they've created over the last year or so, then that could lead to a very substantial contraction in the wider monetary aggregates, in which case we could be in great trouble. And I don't think any modern Western state would do that, because it's committing suicide effectively. It sinks the economy. So my bet is that we're going to have inflation. The other thing that's happened is that it has come into the public domain to a much greater extent that actually we can just create money out of nothing at the state level and spend it. And well, actually, you know, we haven't had great inflation yet, right? So there is this now, you know, modern monetary theory, you hear it described as, you know, the idea that creating money at the state level may actually be part of a solution, right? Because we're not paying interest on it, right? The state can create money, and why, you know, why does it have to pay to borrow its own created money, right? So that idea has come into circuit, and maybe we'll see some progress on that.
Thank you very much. Let's go to, I think it was Gavin had his hand up, then to Paul. Thank you, Gavin.
I've been following modern monetary theory for probably about 6 or 8 years. It depends where the new money is directed. So currently, with paying back of bank loans create money, and basically the state creating money fills that gap. And if you look back in Japan and you look at the a movie called Princes of the Yen, you'll see how Japan directed their money away from the property sector, away from the stock market, away from bonds, into productive areas of the economy, because they didn't have that much money. And it worked very well until they ditched that and tried to become more American. So the matter is, in creating the money, the state can then direct where the resources want to be growing, whether that's roads, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's training, employment, whether it's manufacturing. And one of the things that needs to be weaned off in terms of the Treasury and the Bank of England is just supporting the banking. And thankfully, we got in enough effort early enough so that they didn't try and repeat what had happened with the previous financial crisis, where basically all the money just went to the banks and they just put it on a safety deposit with the Bank of England, earned some interest and said, well, we're not going to do anything else. So, and then we're going to blackmail the government to give us another £1 billion bonus. So that's why I got involved in Royal Bank of Scotland. So in terms of the banking, the difficulty is that in human psychology, people always want to earn more by the end of the year. And this is the problem the Romans had, so they clipped the coins to create more currency. The old analogy, earn £12, 6 shillings and a penny, expenses 12 shillings, expense, happiness, expenses a little bit more, disaster. So there has to be a way in which you keep the carrot for people who always want to make more money to keep everything going along. And in terms of the property market and sector in the UK, which enormous influence, we actually need a time when it's absolutely dead flat and we can have inflation gradually erode it for about 5-10 years. And that has to be done by force. It cannot be done by a market mechanism. And you limit how much can be done on that. And then sorting out the banking system to actually do real banking, which is what Handelsbank can do. There we go.
Thank you, Paul.
And there's a very good book, which I put in the text, which explains how that came from Mesopotamia, and it will give you a good understanding. And that movie is also very good on YouTube.
It is, and I keep forgetting to mention it. So TTF runs TTF Book Club and TTF Film Club, and at some point, Princes of the Yen is going to be one of the documentary films we'll be showing. It's a great, very, very thought-provoking, very eye-opening. Thanks very much, Gavin. That was great. Mr. Paul Carley, back to you. Thank you.
One of the things that still amazes me is that after every cycle we have a downturn. Businesses go under because they can't service their debt, and yet there's still discussions about, oh my God, the banks aren't lending and no one's borrowing. There's no one considered organic growth. Let's grow things organically, but everyone wants something. Everyone wants something yesterday. Now, but I'm touching on a couple of the points. I think the real disaster looming is an EU sovereign default. I think it's something that should have happened after the crisis. We had Angela Merkel in 2011. When I was at UBS in Europe, we were privy to information and research was done for the German government when they're considering what to do about Greece. The research said that if Greece defaults, there will be a minimum cost of €55,000 for every German citizen. If we bail them out, there'll be a minimum cost of €30,000 for every German citizen. Now, the flaw in the research was that they didn't know the maximum for either alternative. So, and typically what happens when you take the cheaper option, there's a price to pay later. And Merkel, they had to go for the cheaper option or bail Greece out because Merkel was on the record as saying that we don't know how much is out there in credit default swaps on Greece or on Spain or Portugal. So they had to do these bailouts because then, they'd had a sharp shock when Lehman's went under because that was the big thing they underestimated. They didn't know how much the system was exposed to credit default swaps on Lehman's. And that's what exacerbated, you dropped a stone in the pond and it just exploded. So exploded, splashed, made a bigger splash than everybody thought it would. So what we've had, rather than a default where a nation takes the default, has a year or two of short, sharp pain, but then starts to borrow at more sustainable rates, and then you get natural organic growth. The currency devalues, so that encourages tourism, that encourages and boosts exports. So you have a cycle that will see that country emerge. But none of these nations were allowed to default, and you can see in the economics there, it's like you've all this all this support and this stimulus is like putting a band-aid over a festering wound.
Yeah.
You've got to rip that band-aid off at some point. And what you have, I mean, the European Central Bank owns 3 trillion now of EU sovereign bonds. I mean, it's just astonishing that, and their demand for these bonds is driving down the auction price. So if you want to buy Italian bonds or something, your return is like, I mean, they are below junk. They are literally worthless, but you'll get about 0.5% return on these. I mean, it's just astonishing. But it's weighing down all these countries. No one is coming out, and France has real issues. Spain, Italy, Portugal. I mean, they're all being suppressed by the weight of this. But everyone's kicking the can down the road because no one wants to be the person on whose watch this explodes. 2 years ago, they announced they were going to taper the stimulus. And within, I think it was 4 months, they had to revise downwards 3 times EU growth for the following year. And then they had to reintroduce stimulus very quickly, and this time on an open-ended basis. I mean, so the EU economy cannot support itself without the stimulus. And that was before COVID. Wow. The problem we have is an EU sovereign default. And I think France is the one to watch. You really need to be careful with France. But the chain reaction that will trigger the contagion and it doesn't bear thinking about. But just one final thing before we go. This isn't new, and none of what the financial crisis was new. The CDSs and credit default swaps and leverage. There's a story in the late 80s. There was a famous currency options trader by the name of Andy Krieger, and he was when options were relatively new, derivatives, etc. And he famously got a call, or Bankers Trust where he worked, famously got a call from the New Zealand Central Bank, and they asked him very politely, said, "Are you aware that the amount of options that you have now written in terms of notional value is actually greater than the amount of currency we have in circulation? So would you mind leaving our currency alone?" And that was how the call went. But again, this is in the late 80s. The leverage, gets out of control, and it's cyclical. It will happen again.
I mean, the one problem you've got is Gavin here, is that now that they have their own currency and the European Central Bank, they can create as much money as they want. The thing is, what they didn't do in all nations, regions, there's a rich area and there's a poor area. And to make a nation work, you take money from the rich area and you put it to the poor, which basically, if you look at the household expenditure, cars, kitchens, cookers, fridges, freezers, washing machines, drills, it's all made in Germany. So basically all the gold piles up to Germany and then it needs to be redistributed. The Germans go, "We're having a great life." But the rest of Europe can't sell enough olives from Greece, and it actually needs Germany to be kicked out of the European Union.
We're going to go to Nigel Cairns. Nigel, thank you for waiting patiently to have your say. Go for
Okay.
it. Please introduce yourself first, Nigel.
Thank you. Well, Nigel Cairns. I agree absolutely with everything that Paul Carlier has just been saying, and I think this situation could unwind much quicker than perhaps we all realise. But in the light of that, I wanted Tarek, who I hope hasn't gone, now to just give us his thoughts on Bitcoin and crypto with regard to the collapse of the or possible collapse of current monetary situation. I'd be very interested to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated issue, and I know time is short. I have one thing which I think I'll say now is that the question is, if you have commodities, for example, in a warehouse, and you have some kind of database record of ownership of that commodity, then a transfer and the registration of the database ownership from one person to another is a way of transferring ownership of the commodity between people when they trade, right? If you strip the commodity away and you now suddenly say that the record of the asset is the asset itself, then I have a problem with that. And I have a problem with it on various other grounds, economic grounds, for example. People, for example, they say, why should we mine gold and spend all of that effort digging the earth, you know, to produce gold or silver or to have a commodity money when we can have Bitcoin? And yet Bitcoin is consuming huge amounts of resources in its system and its infrastructure. Its electrical consumption is more than, I think, Argentina, they said, or Germany. It's growing. So, you know, resources have to be spent on creating a monetary system. You can't just have some kind of contractual agreement. I mean, for example, in order to defend ourselves and give ourselves security, we have an army. We don't have an agreement with Russia that we'll never have a war, or we might do, but we have an army. You know, the guarantee of security is the asset itself, not the record of the asset, not a contract, right? And the question is, should money be something physical, yeah, or should it be something that a body can create out of nothing as a notional quantity? That is a big question. Governments have never shown themselves able to manage that system, and banks have shown themselves never to be able to manage it. And the best period in our history in the West is the gold standard era. So I'm still inclined to gold standard, maybe the state, but definitely not private issue. We do not know who Bitcoin was invented by. We don't know the system. I'm told there may be back doors in it by people who are very high up in that area. And one day it could just be worth zero.
And on that
I think
note,
most of the people have lost all the money. They can't access it. I mean, there must be about a third of Bitcoin that can't be accessed because people have forgotten the code.
folks, we're going to be bringing this session to a close. It's been forgive me if I sound immodest, but I'm just complimenting all the speakers and all the contributions. Plus, of course, my colleague Alexandra, who, as always, has done another amazing job with very, very little to put together on, once again, a very good event for us. We've had Kevin Hollinrake talk, we've had Stuart Willard talk, we've had Professor Nigel Harper talk, we've had Tarek Divani talk, and it's all been really interesting. I've learned a lot and I've really enjoyed it. I hope you all have as well. Our next event is about Europe. It's on Thursday. I think the title is something like, how would you reform the financial system in Europe, or something like that. Please do attend that session if you'd like to. For those of you that don't yet understand this, yeah, TTF has costs. We need subscription members to be able to keep going. So I'll be sending a polite email about that. If you haven't yet become a subscription member, do so. And remember, the way that we've structured it means that quite literally everybody can afford to become a subscription member. Please don't forget that. We want to keep going. We can only keep going if we're sufficiently resourced. So on that note, let's all bring it to a close again, folks. Thank you all very much indeed. I've really enjoyed your company. I've learned a lot as I've gone, and we've heard some great speakers. Thank you all very much indeed. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.